Sally Ann, what are the reasons that people are selling these days, and which are good reasons and which are not good reasons?
Right.
We probably know our competitors pretty well. At least we know who they are, and it's I'm sure crossed our minds that would be a potential acquirer. On the other hand, how do you get into a conversation with a competitor about selling without obviously exposing a lot of things about your company that you wouldn't want your competitors to know,
Sure.
client lists, etc. How do you walk that delicate path? So, curious, how many of you would seriously think that your competitors, what strategics are called, are the kinds of people who would be potential acquirers? And how many of you hesitate to get involved in that conversation for, fears? Yeah, sort of the same number of hands.
Right.
Paul?
Just want to make one comment.
Geography.
Right. And as I said at the beginning, we're talking about selling your company today, but you could be the buyer of a competitor. It's a similar mindset. We talked about this earlier, that you can grow your revenue and your business lines organically by going out there and finding new customers, and you can grow by acquisition. So you can imagine the mindset of your strategic buyer by just imagining what you're looking for. What are let's talk about valuations, because
Sure.
that's an early part of the conversation,
Right.
and it's sort of a level-setting aspect of the conversation to see if, for example, your client, and we're going to talk more about how business brokers and investment bankers work, but how your client perceives the environment that they're selling into. So tell us a little bit of how valuations are formed and the challenges around
Okay.
that.
Great.
We use the house metaphor of painting your house and the things you can do, but then there are things that you're not prepared to do or you can't do.
Right.
The crack in the foundation. That's too. And so, what do we do there? Do we let the buyer discover it on their own?
Fight it and hope they don't find out.
Put a plant in front of the crack, and
No, obviously.
Starting line for all of us is that we are we've had experience building our business, but selling a business is a very different, holds a whole other set of technical issues that presumably we're not expert in. And so it's clearly a critical transaction in our lives for any number of reasons, but we are going into it, a little bit blind. Maybe we've had these conversations before, but many of us haven't actually seen a transaction all the way through. What are some of the disconnects between buyers, sellers, less sophisticated sellers, where the process of a transaction brings those out? I'm thinking about how valuations are created, for example,
Right.
and how what the seller thinks the value is versus what the value needs to be clarified to be if you're going to have a serious transaction conversation. And you were a buyer recently, but from the seller's side, why is the earnout a cautionary tale or a reason for concern?
From the seller's point of view,
Yeah.
one is
How many of you are surprised to hear, because we had this conversation earlier about this idea of the burnt out entrepreneur. I mean, I have this chance to work with a lot of entrepreneurs, even very successful ones, who have some moments nowadays where they ask themselves whether they've made all the right decisions, and because they are working harder in some cases for less or the same amount as they were making years earlier. And so that issue of exhaustion is coming up. I don't know if anyone's going to raise their hand, but I mean, how many of you realize that part of the reason you're thinking about selling has to do with just your own outlook on entrepreneurship as a lifestyle, and where we are with that? There's a few different ways the numbers come about, right? It's not just here's $1 million, thank you. It's earnouts and holdbacks. What about on just the pre-planning side, where the implication of taxes on what you actually net? We were going through the kind of the role that the intermediary plays, and it's the pre-planning, it's the marketing, and then what?
Identify.
So that sounds like a year and a half of transactional work, 1, 2, or 3 years of earnout.
Yeah.
And let's say that shape-up work on your business is a year's worth of work.
Yeah.
So it's a 3 to 5 year
It's a lengthy process. Right. It doesn't happen immediately, and this is why it's so important to do.
I just want to go back to valuations, or really your books for a moment, because what has to happen to your books as you get ready for sale that maybe those of us who run closely held businesses might need to be aware of?
Sure.
So just to summarize this process, how much of this is basic block and tackle? Have a thoughtful business plan that really reflects what you think versus, as you artfully said, treat it as if it were homework. And how much of it is sort of black magic in terms of, you know, how deals get done and how well people negotiate and that kind of thing. How many of you have started to sell your company and it didn't work out? How many of you have gone through the process? 1, 2, 3. Does anyone want to share reasons why it didn't work out? David?
Law firm.
I just want to summarize what I'm hearing from those messages is run your company using best practices and systems that if somebody were to look under the hood at any given moment, it shows well. But the reasons to sell are either personal or the industry is paying premiums now and you've decided this is the moment. If those two things aren't happening, you're better off just, if you're able to, just keep running the company. Let me use both. I think there's something in common between Mary and David's question, and this is a good moment, I think, and we'll wrap it up with this, but a good moment to see how advisors advise, okay? So I think Mary and David have both identified this idea of, when we heard that a growing company is a better company to sell. Of course, growing takes investment. So how do our advisors advise us on this idea of growing today versus maximizing profit? You know, I just want to close with how important conversations like this are. I think you actually just nailed it. You know, do you work on the day-to-day or do you work with these big strategic issues? There is also no right answer to that. But it's very rare that business owners pull themselves out of their office, away from their clients and their employees and their vendors, and come to a place where they're amongst their own kind and have these conversations. And we call that working on the business, and we call that being strategic. That's the very exercise that went on here today. And you know, in the case of Inc., of course, if you're a reader of the magazine, we value that strategic conversation deeply. And so I encourage those of you who are interested to continue that dialogue with us as council members and things like that. We love that conversation. That's an important one to have. We think it bears fruit. Thanks so much to Sally Ann Hughes for joining us for this conversation, for Paul Rich for adding his wisdom along the way, and Rothstein Cass, a great CPA firm that's worth having a dialogue with at any stage of your growth. And thanks to all of you for making the time. Time is, when it comes down to it, the number one asset we're all dealing with. It's a limited amount. So thank you for taking the time to join us here at Inc. headquarters today. Thanks again.
Thank you.